Hey everyone, welcome back to LGBT Stories, where we dive into emotional, romantic, and sometimes heart-wrenching tales from the LGBTQ plus community. Today, I'm bringing you a story that will take you on a roller coaster of emotions. It's a true story about a man who, on a night when his wife was lost in her drunken haze, found himself in an unexpected and intense connection with her nephew. This isn't just a story about desire. It's about loneliness, longing, and the moments that change everything. So, buckle up and get ready for a journey you won't forget. Let's dive in. While my wife drowned herself in alcohol as usual, I eventually found myself playing with her nephew all night. An experience so crazy and exciting that I'll never forget it. The evening had begun like so many others. The quiet hum of normalcy filled the house, only interrupted by the occasional clink of ice against glass and the soft buzz of the television in the background. My wife had come home earlier than usual, flushed and giggling from an impromptu happy hour with friends. She had barely kicked off her heels before reaching for another drink. Her laughter tapered into the slurred, self-indulgent mutterings that had become all too familiar. I stood in the kitchen, clearing away the remnants of dinner. The weight of routine pressed heavily on me. It wasn't new, this feeling of loneliness that settled in the pit of my stomach each time she disappeared into her drunken haze. The rhythmic clatter of dishes against the sink was the only thing keeping my mind occupied, but even that couldn't distract from the growing emptiness. A soft knock on the door frame broke my focus. I turned to see him, my wife's nephew. His posture was casual, but his gaze was sharp. Over the years, he had grown into himself, shedding the uncertainty of youth and replacing it with quiet confidence. His presence filled the space in a way that felt almost unnatural, like he was seeing something in me that I wasn't sure I wanted to be seeing. "Hey, everything okay?" His voice was low and careful. I nodded, setting a plate on the drying rack. "Yeah, just thinking." His gaze flickered toward the living room, where his aunt had curled up on the couch, another drink in hand. He exhaled slowly, stepping further inside. "She's had a few, huh?" I sighed, wiping my hands on a towel. You know how she is. He had seen it before. The way she slipped too easily into intoxication, the way she laughed too loud, slurred her words just a little too much, and neglected to notice anything beyond her own indulgence. His expression darkened for a brief moment, his jaw tightening before he leaned against the counter. "You shouldn't have to deal with it alone," he murmured, his voice softer now. I forced a small smile. "It's nothing I'm not used to." Something flickered in his eyes, something that made my chest tighten involuntarily. He didn't look away, and for a moment, the space between us felt charged with something unspoken, something neither of us dared acknowledge. A burst of laughter from the living room shattered the silence, pulling me back into reality. I cleared my throat. I should check on her. He hesitated, like he wanted to say more, but instead, he gave a slow nod. "Yeah, I'll be here if you need anything." I didn't respond, just offered him a small, grateful smile before stepping away. But even as I moved toward the living room, I could still feel the weight of his gaze lingering behind me. The dim lighting did little to soften the mess of my wife sprawled on the couch. Her head was tilted to the side, her lips parted slightly as soft, uneven breaths escaped her. The half-finished glass of wine on the table sat untouched now, condensation pooling beneath it. She was out, just like always. I stared at her for a long moment, a dull, tired ache settling in my chest. This was our life, her drinks, my solitude, and the quiet, endless loop that neither of us seemed willing to break. A shift behind me made me turn. He was there again, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable as he glanced between me and his aunt. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head as he took a step forward. "She's out," he murmured. I nodded. "Yeah, she usually is by this time." He studied me, his gaze lingering on my face longer than it should have. "It's not fair," he said, barely above a whisper. "The way she treats you." I felt my fingers tighten against the counter. It wasn't something anyone had ever said to me before, not in this way. People nodded sympathetically, made small talk around it, but never acknowledged it outright. "You deserve better," he added, taking another step toward me. "You shouldn't have to spend your nights like this." I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say? That I had accepted it, that I had convinced myself it wasn't so bad. That would have been a lie, and we both knew it. He reached out then, his fingers brushing lightly against the back of my hand. The touch was hesitant, but sent a pulse of something electric through me. I glanced up at him, startled by the intensity in his gaze. "Come sit with me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I hesitated for only a moment before letting him lead me back to the kitchen. The air felt different now, heavier, more intimate. The soft glow of the overhead light cast long shadows against the walls. The distant hum of the television blended with the slow, uneven rhythm of my wife's breathing. I sat down, fingers grazing the cool surface of the table, grounding me. He sat across from me, leaning in slightly, his forearms resting on the wood. His gaze never wavered, steady and searching, as if he could see through every carefully constructed layer I had built over the years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was actually looking at me, really seeing me. "You're not happy," he said, and it wasn't a question. I swallowed, my hands resting in my lap. "It's complicated," I said. "No," he countered, shaking his head. "It's not. She doesn't appreciate you. She doesn't see you." Something inside me cracked, a tiny fissure in the armor I had worn for so long. It wasn't just his words. It was the way he looked at me, like I was worth something more, like I wasn't just an afterthought. I turned away, blinking rapidly, but he didn't let me retreat. His fingers reached across the table, his touch feather-light as they closed over mine, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. "You deserve to feel wanted," he murmured, his thumb tracing slow, deliberate circles over my skin. The warmth of his touch seeped into me, unraveling something deep inside. My breath hitched. I knew this was dangerous, knew that we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't take back. But in that moment, I didn't care. I just wanted to feel something again. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "This isn't." My voice came out softer than I intended, unsteady. "We can't." His grip didn't tighten, didn't pull. He simply remained there, waiting, not pushing, not demanding, just existing in this moment with me. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, and I would. I should have. The words were right there, teetering on the edge of my lips, but they wouldn't come. Instead, my fingers curled slightly beneath his, responding before my mind could catch up. My heart pounded, my pulse drumming in my ears as I forced myself to meet his gaze. His eyes burned into mine, searching, waiting. "You don't have to do this," he said softly, and for a fleeting second, I thought he was giving me an out. But then he added, "But I think you want to." That single sentence sent a shiver down my spine. He wasn't wrong, and that terrified me. I pulled away slightly, not enough to sever contact completely, but enough to make him hesitate. He leaned in just a fraction, his warmth brushing against the space between us. Close, but not overstepping. My fingers trembled, hovering just inches away from his. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled, his eyes never leaving mine. "Maybe it's not about knowing," he said. "Maybe it's just about feeling." The weight of his words settled in my chest, heavy and undeniable. For so long, I had been numb, walking through life with quiet resignation, accepting my loneliness as if it were something I deserved. But now I felt something again. I closed my eyes for just a moment, letting the silence stretch between us, thick and charged. The muffled sound of my wife's occasional murmur from the living room was a reminder of the world I was about to step away from, a reminder that once I crossed this line, there would be no going back. But when I opened my eyes again and found him still waiting, still offering, not demanding, not pushing, I realized I'd already made my choice. Slowly, hesitantly, I let my fingers slide back beneath his, accepting the warmth he was offering. He leaned closer, his presence surrounding me, and for the first time in years, I let myself fall into it. The air between us thickened, charged with an energy neither of us dared name. My pulse thrummed in my throat as I took a slow, unsteady breath. The silence stretched between us like a fragile thread. The only sound were the distant hum of the television and the slow rise and fall of my wife's breathing from the other room. The world outside this small, dimly lit space still existed, but right now, it felt like it was just the two of us and nothing else mattered. His fingers remained against my skin, warm and reassuring. His gaze locked onto mine with a quiet intensity. "You don't have to pretend anymore," he murmured. "Not with me." My heart pounded as I exhaled slowly, a shudder running through me. "I'm not pretending," I said, but my voice was barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure if I was lying or if I had simply convinced myself that denying my own emotions was the only way to survive. He tilted his head slightly, studying me, his thumbs still tracing small, slow circles over the back of my hand. "I see the way you look at me," he said, his voice even softer now. "Like you're afraid to let yourself feel anything. But you do feel something, don't you?" I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "It doesn't matter," I said. "It does," he countered, his grip firming just slightly, grounding me. "You deserve to be happy. You deserve more than this." My lips parted, but no words came. How could I respond to that? How could I tell him that I had spent years convincing myself that I was fine, that this was the life I had chosen, and there was no changing it now? But he saw through it, past all the carefully constructed walls I had built around myself. I pulled my hand back, my pulse hammering as I pressed my palms against my lap. "We can't," I whispered. "It's wrong." His expression shifted slightly. Something flickered in his eyes. Was it disappointment or understanding? Maybe both. He sighed, leaning back slightly, but his gaze never wavered. "I don't think it is," he said. "Not when it feels like this." I stood abruptly, needing distance, needing air. My chair scraped against the floor as I stepped away from the table, crossing my arms tightly over my chest. "This isn't a choice," I said, shaking my head. "I'm married. You're a nephew. There's no way this moment between us could ever mean anything." He was silent for a long time, just watching me. Then finally, he nodded. "If that's what you really believe," he said, his voice measured and careful, "then I'll drop it. I won't say another word. But if there's even a part of you that's unsure, then don't lie to yourself." I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter, my breath coming in uneven bursts. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he had imagined everything, that I felt nothing, but the words wouldn't come because, deep down, I knew they wouldn't be true. I heard him shift his chair, scraping softly against the floor, and then the quiet sound of his footsteps as he approached. My body tensed as he stopped just behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "If you don't want me to be here," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against my spine, "say the word, and I'll leave." My fingers curled around the counter's edge. The silence stretched between us, each second heavier than the last, and still I said nothing. His breath hitched slightly, and then I felt it, the lightest brush of his fingertips along my arm. It was barely a touch, yet it sent a shiver through me, so intense that I almost gasped. He hesitated, waiting, watching for any sign of rejection, but I didn't move. I stayed rooted in place, my body betraying me. He exhaled almost shakily before his hand slid lower, his fingers grazing mine where they gripped the counter. It wasn't forceful. It wasn't demanding. It was just there, an offering, an unspoken question. I turned my head slightly, my breath unsteady as I finally looked at him. His eyes were dark and unreadable, but his expression was open and honest. There was no pressure, no expectation, just quiet patience. A sound from the living room startled me, a shift in my wife's position, a muttered incoherence in her sleep. My breath caught. Reality slammed back into place like a bolt of lightning. I yanked my hand back, stepping away so fast I nearly stumbled. "We can't do this," I said, my voice harsh, more to myself than to him. "This is insane." I don't know what I was thinking. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a slow breath before nodding. "I understand," he said, but the way he said it, the way his jaw tensed and his eyes lingered on me, made it clear that this wasn't over. Not really. And as I turned and hurried out of the kitchen, retreating down the hallway to my bedroom, I knew with certainty that no matter how much I tried to fight it, Something between us had shifted irreversibly. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it as I exhaled, my breath shaky. My hands are trembling, my skin still burning where he had touched me. I pressed my fingers against my temples, willing myself to think rationally, to push down the emotions clawing their way to the surface, but the silence in the room did little to help. It was deafening. I could still feel the weight of his gaze, still hear his voice lingering in my mind. You don't have to pretend anymore. Not with me. I squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. I wasn't just hearing his voice. I was feeling it. The warmth of his presence, the way he had looked at me with something raw and unspoken, the way his fingers had lingered against mine as if he wasn't ready to let go. A distant sound echoed through the house, a soft shuffle, the creak of floorboards under careful steps. My heart jumped into my throat. I held my breath, listening. It stopped outside my door. I didn't move. Seconds stretched, the air between us thick and electric, even with the door separating us. And then, as if he knew I was still awake, still thinking about him, just as much as he was thinking about me, he spoke. You don't have to pretend anymore. His voice was quiet, barely audible through the wood, but it sent a shiver through me. Not with me. I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening against the door handle. I knew I should tell him to leave, but I didn't. He took a slow step closer. Uncle James, he murmured, his voice quieter now, more cautious, as if testing the air between us. You don't have to pretend with me. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. I could hear the low murmur of my wife shifting in her sleep from the other room. The weight of her presence still tethered me to reality, but it wasn't enough to stop the way my pulse quickened. This is just a bad idea, I whispered, more to myself than to him. Then tell me to go, he said simply. He wasn't pushing. He wasn't pressuring. He was just waiting. I parted my lips, but nothing came out. He took another step, closing the distance between us. His gaze was steady and patient. You don't have to say anything, he said, his voice low and careful. I just want to be here with you. I exhaled slowly. It was wrong. I knew it. But in this moment, with the house cloaked in shadows and loneliness hanging between us like a thick fog, I couldn't find the strength to push him away. He lifted his hand again, slower this time, giving me the chance to stop him, but I didn't move. As his fingers brushed against mine once more, his touch was light but deliberate, a quiet invitation. My breathing shallowed as I looked up at him. His dark eyes studied me with a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, something that made my skin prickle with anticipation. The sound of the television droned on in the background, grounding us. Come sit, he said, nodding toward the couch in the den just off the kitchen. I hesitated for just a moment, then followed. The cushions dipped beneath our weight as we settled into the quiet space. The dim light cast a warm glow over his features, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the subtle flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. He turned slightly, facing me. I don't like seeing you like this, he admitted, his voice softer now. Like you're just existing. I let out a quiet breath, shaking my head. It's not that simple. Maybe it is, he countered. You deserve more than this. I met his eyes, searching for some kind of clarity, maybe, but all I found was the unspoken truth that had been simmering between us for far too long. He reached up, his fingers brushing along the side of my face. The gesture was so simple, so intimate, that it sent a shiver down my spine. His touch lingered, barely grazing my jaw before trailing down, skimming the curve of my throat. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped this before it started. But instead, I leaned into the warmth of his palm, my eyes fluttering shut for just a second too long. He exhaled sharply, as if he hadn't expected me to let him in, but now that I had, he wasn't hesitating. His fingers slid beneath my chin, tilting my face toward his. Uncle James, he murmured again, his breath warm against my lips. I inhaled shakily, my hands gripping the cushion beneath me, as if that would somehow keep me grounded. This is, I started, but the words caught in my throat as he closed the remaining distance, brushing his lips over mine in the lightest, most tentative kiss. A whisper of contact, nothing more, but it was enough to set my whole body alight. I let out a slow, shaky breath, my eyes still closed, my heart pounding. He pulled back only slightly, just enough to let me decide what happened next. I didn't move away. Instead, I tilted my chin up, closing the distance once more. This time, the kiss wasn't hesitant. It was slow, deliberate. His lips moved against mine in a way that felt like discovery, like unraveling something that had been waiting to be set free. A deep sigh escaped me as his fingers tangled in my hair, his other hand settling on my waist, drawing me closer. The heat between us grew, melting away whatever resistance I had left. The television hummed in the background, my wife slow, even breathing a dull reminder that the rest of the world still existed. But in this moment, in this space, it was just us. He pulled me onto his lap, his hands steady against my hips as I settled against him, my body molding to his like we had done this 1,000 times before. My fingers skimmed his jaw, tracing the rough edges of his stubble before sliding into his hair. I had forgotten what this felt like, what it felt like to be wanted, to be touched with care, with reverence. His lips trailed lower, skimming along my jaw, down the column of my throat. I arched instinctively, a soft gasp escaping me as his hands roamed, exploring every inch of me with unhurried intent. The reality of where we were, of what we were doing, flickered at the edge of my mind, but it wasn't enough to stop me. Not now, not after feeling this, after remembering what it was like to be desired, to be cherished. And so I let it happen. I let myself drown in him, in his touch, in his warmth, in the way he whispered my name like it meant something. As the night stretched on, as the walls I'd spent years building crumbled away, I knew there was no turning back now. I didn't want to. I didn't fight it when he guided me to stand, nor when he pressed a silent question into the air between us, waiting for my answer without speaking. I had already answered in the way I hadn't pulled away, in the way my body leaned into him instead of away. A soft creak echoed under our weight as he led me from the kitchen, past the dim glow of the living room, while my wife remained sprawled on the couch, lost in her own intoxication. Each step felt heavy, thick with a kind of urgency that wasn't rushed. Somewhere along the way, we had shifted direction, finding ourselves in the hallway. My breath hitched when I realized where we were heading. The bedroom, my bedroom. It should have felt wrong. It should have felt unthinkable. But it didn't. I stepped inside, his presence following close behind me as I shut the door with deliberate care, locking out the rest of the world. The air was warmer here, more intimate, thick with the weight of everything we weren't saying. For a moment, we simply stood there, staring at each other in the dim light spilling in from the street lamp outside. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those eyes, held everything neither of us had the courage to say aloud. "You sure?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of his question was anything but light. I exhaled slowly, letting my hand find his. "Yes." And just like that, the space between us disappeared. Time ceased to exist. The hours melted together, lost in the unrelenting pull between us. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't reckless. It was slow burning, stretching into the kind of night that refused to be forgotten. I had forgotten what this felt like, to be seen, to be wanted, to have someone's undivided attention linger on me for so long that the outside world faded into nothing. At some point, we tangled ourselves in sheets. The darkness wrapped around us like a secret neither of us was willing to give up just yet. He traced lines against my skin, his touch lingering even in the stillness. There were no rushed movements, no frantic urgency, just an unspoken, quiet understanding that neither of us wanted the night to end. And it didn't. It stretched on long past the moment exhaustion should have claimed us. Every time silence settled, we found new ways to fill it. Whispered confessions, soft laughter, stolen glances in the dark. I had never spoken this much in a single night. I had never felt this awake. I could feel the night slipping away, but I wasn't ready to let it go. I think we eventually did it like 5 or 6 times. I was surprised he even lasted that long. But then, all of a sudden, a sound from beyond the door made my breath catch. a shift in weight, the unmistakable mumble of my wife stirring in her sleep. We both froze. My heart slammed against my ribs. The reality of what we had done sank in like an anchor. For a moment, neither of us moved. The tension crackled between us like a live wire. The house was still, except for the slow, steady sound of my wife's breathing, followed by another heavy sigh as she resettled herself. The silence stretched until I was sure we were in the clear, but my pulse remained unsteady. He exhaled beside me, rolling onto his side so he could see me better. "You okay?" I nodded, though my body still hummed with adrenaline. "Yeah." He studied me for a moment, as if deciding whether to believe me. Then, slowly, his fingers brushed against mine again. This time, softer, more deliberate. "You're thinking too much," he murmured, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. I sighed, shifting slightly under the sheets. "I can't help it." He smirked, something teasing flickering in his expression. "You did for a while." I felt my face heat, but I didn't deny it. Silence settled again, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was warm, heavy with something I wasn't ready to name just yet. As the minutes ticked on, exhaustion finally began creeping in, lulling me into a drowsy haze. His hand found mine beneath the sheets, fingers tangling lazily. I let them stay there. Dawn was already beginning to creep through the curtains when I stirred. A quiet, peaceful warmth pressed against my back, a steady rise and fall that wasn't my own. For a moment, I let myself exist there, caught between the haze of sleep and wakefulness, unwilling to move, unwilling to let go. But reality always had a way of pulling me back. I shifted, and as I did, I felt him stir behind me. A quiet exhale, a slight adjustment of weight. Neither of us spoke for a long time. When I finally turned, meeting his gaze in the dim morning light, something inside me clenched. We had done something reckless, something irreversible. But as he reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from my forehead, all I could think about was how alive I felt. He leaned in just slightly, his lips barely grazing my temple before pulling away. "I should go," he said. I swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah." Neither of us moved, not yet. It wasn't regret I felt as I watched him finally slip from the bed, gathering his clothes, moving as quietly as possible to avoid waking my wife. It was something else entirely, something I wasn't ready to let go of. He paused at the door, glancing back at me, something unreadable in his gaze. "Good night, Uncle James," I whispered. It was morning now, but I didn't correct him. Instead, I whispered good night, and then he was gone. I lay there long after he had left, staring at the ceiling, feeling the absence of his warmth beside me. The house was still. The world outside was waking, and I had never felt more awake in my life. But the craziest part was that the story didn't end there. The first thing I noticed was the weight beside me was gone. The sheets still held the faint warmth of his body, but he was no longer there. For a moment, I lay still, my mind sluggish as it wrestled with the blurred haze of the night before. The memories rushed back in fragments. The quiet whispers, the stolen glances, the way our hands had found each other in the dim glow of the room. The way he had touched me like I was something precious, something he didn't want to lose. The weight of it all pressed down on my chest like an invisible hand. I forced myself to sit up. The morning light spilling through the thin curtains cast soft lines across the bed. My heart pounded as I listened to the house. It was still too still. The quiet was unnerving, thick with the unspoken. My wife's breathing had stopped, at least the slow, drunken rhythm that had filled the house for hours. I swallowed, pushing the sheets aside as I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. The floor was cool beneath my feet, grounding me in reality. My clothes were strewn carelessly across the room, a stark reminder of what had transpired only hours ago. I grabbed my robe, pulling it around me with shaky hands, before stepping toward the door. The hallway stretched ahead, bathed in the soft glow of morning. My breath caught as I heard the faint rustle of movement from the kitchen. I exhaled, moving cautiously down the hall, my pulse thrumming with every step. When I reached the doorway, I saw him. He was standing at the counter, his back to me, sipping from a glass of water. He was already dressed, his hair still slightly disheveled from sleep. My heart clenched at the sight of him, at the familiarity we had forged in just one night, at the way it felt so impossible and yet so inevitable. He must have sensed me because he turned, his eyes meeting mine instantly. Something flickered in his expression. Relief, uncertainty, a quiet understanding. I wasn't sure, but it settled between us, thick and unspoken. "Morning," he said, his voice hushed. I nodded, stepping into the kitchen. "Morning." We stood there in silence for a moment, the tension from the night before still lingering between us like a ghost, refusing to be exorcised. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "I was going to leave before you woke up," he said. I wasn't sure how to respond. "Why didn't you?" He gave a soft, humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "I don't know. Maybe I just wasn't ready to walk away yet." I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "We shouldn't talk about this," I said. "I know," he replied, looking at me, searching my face. "But we will, won't we?" I had no answer for that. Before I could say anything else, a sound from the living room made my stomach twist. Heavy footsteps, a low, tired groan. My wife was waking up. Panic shot through me, but he was already moving. He stepped past me, his shoulder brushing mine as he made his way toward the back door. "I'll see you later," he murmured, his voice too quiet for anyone else to hear. And then he was gone. I stood frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs as my wife shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing her face with one hand. Her eyes were blurry from sleep or the remnants of her drinking. "Morning," she grunted, moving past me toward the coffee maker. She didn't even glance in my direction. The relief that washed over me was immediate, followed quickly by a deep, sinking guilt. I busied myself at the sink, pretending to rinse a glass that was already clean. My mind raced, replaying the night, the morning, the way her nephew had looked at me before he left, the way he had waited for me to say something, to tell him how I felt, what I wanted. But I had said nothing, and now I wasn't sure if I ever would. So that wraps up the story. I think I'm so curious what you think of it, since I really don't know what to think of it myself. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks in advance. If you like this story, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more emotional and heart-wrenching LGBT tales. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And as always, feel free to share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.